My name is Morten Tønnessen, and I'm a professor of philosophy, as you see, in Stavanger, Norway. And I am Norwegian-born, Estonian-educated, with PhD from Estonia, and Brazilian married. And the topic of my talk is neurosemiotics across species. And the presentation is based on excerpts from a book chapter that is forthcoming with the same name that will appear in a Routledge handbook of neurosemiotics. So a handbook on neurosemiotics is around the corner, and this is one of maybe 3 chapters, if I remember correctly, with a biosemiotic framing one way or another. And I would like to mention one of my affiliations that is especially relevant for this topic, and that's the Cognitive and Behavioral Neuroscience Lab at the University of Stavanger, which is being established. And I happen to be the chair of the steering group of this cognitive lab. But the lab, of course, will facilitate experimental work, and the paper I'm presenting today is rather groundwork, theoretically. And here you see a couple of my colleagues illustrating cognitive research. So my background and also my framing for this talk on neurosemiotics is that I'm coming from biosemiotics and have worked quite a bit with Uexküll theory. So I will have that approach and that focus when I now discuss neurosemiotics. So that's a field related to neural phenomena or aspects of what we might call cognitive science. And what I'm exploring in this paper is what we can say generally about neurosemiotics that is valid across species for all sentient animals, any organism with a nervous system. And one of the reasons why I think this is relevant is because it's an opportunity to say something about how neurosemiotic perspectives are important within the Uexküll theory, even though Jakob von Uexküll worked at a time where natural science had not done as much work on cognition and the modern kind of work that is being done on studying brain function and the nervous system and so on. But it remains a fact that in order to understand the umwelt of sentient organisms, we need to understand neurosemiotic aspects of their experience and behavior. And I'll also try to show how this is, some of these core ideas are central in Uexküll's work as well. We could start out with asking, what are nerves for? Why do we need them, and what do we use them for? And it might be good to ask a fundamental question about this, because perception and cognition is in one sense so obvious to us as perceptive, conscious, self-reflective beings. But this is a quote from Jesper Hoffmeyer, where he says very briefly and succinctly what nerve cells are about and what change they made in the evolution of life. He writes, movement, as animals operate with, demands that muscle cells at one corner of the organism instantaneously, that is in microseconds, coordinate their activity with muscle cells at the other end. And to achieve this coordination from the perspective of a single cell, long distance communication within the organism became the very art of nerve cells. So the nervous system, of course, is related both to the perceptual faculties of an organism, but also to the effective or operational faculties. So it's, of course, some kind of mediator between what we perceive and how we act, largely through our muscles. And now I'll say a little bit about Uexküll and his work in this context. First of all, we can note that he wrote several articles on what was in his time in German called Nerven- und Muskelphysiologie. Yeah. They cannot see the slides. Okay, sorry. So suppose I have to do that from here. Is it appearing now?
Yes, yes.
Should I go back?
No, you should see. Yeah, you should do.
Now it's showing. Okay. So I got this far. So especially in the period 1892 to 1915, Uexküll wrote another number of articles on topics related to what we now can call neurosemiotics. And it's an important biographical fact that what we can call his neurosemiotic outlook, or these kind of topics, is what convinced him that Umwelt theory could be of wider interest and that he could have something to say about biology more generally and not just about specific species that he had studied. So he made some realizations during this early work, which convinced him that Umwelt theory was needed and something he could develop. And we see in the Umwelt theory that Uexküll emphasizes the central role of the central nervous system for the constitution of the Umwelt. And that's easy to recognize also in depictions of the functional cycle. And in the main scientific biological work of Uexküll, Theoretische Biologie, he also mentioned related topics very early on, one of the first few pages, as he is starting and presenting the whole book. And he writes programmatically, the task of biology consists in expanding the lessons of Kant's research in two directions. One, to take into account the role of our bodies, particularly our sense organs and our central nervous system. And two, to study other subjects, the animals' relations to objects. And these 2 points are, of course, related as well, since object perception by sentient animals is mediated through the nervous system. So this is really at the core of the Umwelt theory, at least insofar as the Umwelt theory is about sentient animals with a nervous system. And I'll discuss the notion of neural codes. That was not a term at Uexküll's time, as far as I know. But I think we can relate those in hindsight also to the workings of organisms with a nervous system within an Umwelt framing. And they could, in that case, be taken to relate to the integration and interaction between the Innenwelt and the Umwelt. And the Innenwelt is Uexküll's term for the inner subjective world, which in a way mirrors the Umwelt, the outer subjective world. So it relates also to the animal's distinction between what is inside it and its body and what is outside, what is the environment surrounding it. There are, in addition to recognizing that the Innenwelt is a neurosemiotic construct, addressing how the nervous system works, we can also acknowledge that other central coinages by Uexküll, such as the Merkwelt and the Wirkwelt, are also really neurosemiotic constructs. So many of his core terms are relevant in the context of neurosemiotics. And the Merkwelt has to do with our use of our senses, and the Wirkwelt has to do with the use of our muscles. And this all goes through the nervous system. Now I'll ask some questions about the neural code and how it relates to semiotics. And there are some discussions ongoing that are informative, that also show that there is disagreement between different semioticians with regard to whether or not we can regard the neural code as a proper semiotic code at all. And there's also disagreement more widely as well, whether the code metaphor in this context is useful, whether it's informative, whether it says anything we can test or study closely. And it's also related to another fundamental question concerning whether mental representations exist. And here as well, there are different schools, with some saying that there are representations, others that we can explain cognitive and neural processes and phenomena without making any assumption about representations. First, here's a definition of the neural code. And that term is sometimes used in singular and sometimes in plural. Here it says in an encyclopedia definition that the neural code can be characterized as something that triggers a signal that carries an abstract representation of some signal or process of interest. And that neural coding is being conducted in neurons that act as information processing channels that take incoming information, integrate it, and produce a signal that contains information encoded in the neural electrical activity. So in this view, neural codes and neural coding is related to encoding and decoding of signals. And there's a lot of semiotic terms here. So of course, one way to relate to this is to say that this is obviously semiotic. But as I said, there's considerable disagreement about how this can be understood. In a quite recent Target article, the neuroscientist Romain Brett argues that neural codes is not a useful metaphor. And he says that what we refer to as neural codes are unstructured and therefore unable to represent relations. And he says that the neural coding metaphor cannot provide a valid basis for theories of brain function because it is incompatible with both the causal structure of the brain and the representational requirements of cognition. So he does not deny that there are some kind of inner representations related to cognition, but he says that the neural code doesn't explain or fit with such a view. And one response to this paper is written by the biosemioticians Terence Deacon and Joanna Rasasek-Leonardi. And they claim that the coding metaphor has become more problematic than helpful. So they want to use other language rather than referring to a neural code. But at the same time, they do not want to abandon the concept of representation altogether. So they want to reconstruct what kind of representation we can refer to in relation to neural processes. And they build on person semiotics combined with systems dynamics and try to develop an alternative view where they think it makes sense to refer to neural representations, but stress that these representations must be understood as dynamical and given a conventional understanding of codes as fixed. This rules out a conception of a neural code. So they say that term is out of place. It doesn't help understanding these phenomena. Marcello Barbieri, the code biologist, takes a different view. He regards the neural code as one of several central important organic codes and thinks that code biology can provide a framework for understanding neural codes. And he admits that the neural code involves an unknown mechanism. And that's some people's criticism as well, that by referring to a neural code, you name it, but there's a lot that is misunderstood regarding what mechanism is really at work in the nervous system. But in Barbieri's view, neural codes made conscious life as well as feelings possible. And he distinguished between simpler and more complex animals, saying that the simpler ones have pretty much hardwired behavior. And in those cases, the neural code would, to a large extent, determine perception and action, whereas more complex animals also operate with neural codes, but have interpretive skills, which makes things more complex. There's also this ambiguity related to whether we refer to one universal neural code, which Barbieri does as well, or in the plural form, that there are different specific neural codes that are typical for different sense organs or histomological tissues or physiologies. My own view is, in a way, a middle path between these two that I've presented now, the Persians and the code biologist. I think that it could make sense to maintain a terminology of codes in this context, but it would need to be reconceptualized. So I distinguish between fixed codes, which mostly compares to what Barbieri often refers to, and flexible codes, such as, for instance, ecological codes. And there's other authors as well, including Kalevi and Timo Maran, who has promoted similar ideas that some codes should be regarded as more flexible, especially in an ecological setting. And I think we need to understand neural codes in context with ecological context as well, to understand how cognitively complex animals perceive and act. I think this kind of, well, the different notions of codes, with some, like the neural code, being fixed, and others, like ecological codes, being more flexible and fluid, is necessary to understand complex animal behavior. And I think one way to integrate some of these modern themes with umwelt theory is to focus on how specific organisms and species are constrained by their specific physiology, which defines the possible scope of their subjective experience. So even with a universal, in one sense, neural code at bottom that is involved in the translation from sensory stimuli to perceptual images and so on, we can understand this related to how organisms differ in their ecological context and in their exact physiology and in their life experience, which further configures the animal's sensitivity to different phenomena and to their inclinations behaviorally and so on. So in this way, I think that we can say that the neural code or neural codes is utilized by animals in ways that make sense for the animal and that leads to diverse and context-dependent behaviors. And now I should wrap it up. And maybe I could just stop here. Yeah. Right, please let me know again if there's someone online. Yeah.
No, that's okay.
I could go on a bit if there's no questions.
Can you go back to the slide where you define
Where I define the neural code.
Yes.
Here. So at the beginning, you see that there's one signal that really is representing the former signal. So that would be starting really with sensory stimuli that triggers spikes in the electric activity of neurons, which could be interpreted as a signal representing the initial sensory stimuli, and which is eventually communicated to the brain and triggers maybe a mental representation. So that's like a classical view, but that is under criticism by some.
Thanks for the clarification. My question would be, in what way this type of approach tell us something about the methodological, methodological, this first person experience, so to speak, and collectively expressed in other needs? Because as code users, so to speak, we're not aware of this technology, but nonetheless we can have many other presentations. So yeah, sure. What about this other phenomenological continuum of experience that is firstness and the relationship with this?
So you talk about phenomenological code.
Yeah,
what do you mean by that?
The counterpart of this would be the experience as such. Terms of phenomenology.
Sure, but part of this understanding could also imply that, I mean, it's supposed to explain how sensory stimuli can lead to experience, right? So that would be the end point in a way. And so one question, of course, is whether this happens automatically and how we can understand organisms as interpretative if there are some automated processes. But the claim really, if you say that there is a neural code, is that there's some kind of automated or fixed process that makes one signal trigger another one in a maybe automated fashion. But of course, we know that perception is not all about sensation. It's not all about the constant bombardment of sensory signals, but perception, especially in complex animals, has an agenda. It's selective, and it relates also to maybe the immediate needs or attention of the animal. So perception, of course, is edited, so to speak, and not simply an automated mirroring of all the sensory signals. So, but I think what makes sense is to say that the sensory input that is possibly experienced is partly mediated in a pretty much automated fashion. And then maybe the higher faculties, minds, are at work at the end point, so that sensation is not the end of the story. It's only the physiological basis of experience in a way.
That sounds very compatible with Seneca's view of medium angular sensation, right? The notion that final causation of the dynamics functionality can influence the material and vision process until getting that goes. And the other way around, material basis perception, but determine the constraint higher process.
Sure.
And that's my question is just something that doesn't have anything to do.
Yeah, and I also think that maybe the more complex an animal is, the more it is driven by its experience of its own needs. And also in the case of human beings, which are self-reflective, I mean, we can maybe be extremely focused on something and extremely ignorant of other things that we could have experienced if we only paid attention to it, right? So, but I think that what drives our attention is more about interpretation and interpretive skills, whereas some of the biological foundation is more automated. And that's why I also think it makes sense to, it might make sense to apply this notion of neural codes as part of a bigger whole. One question is whether there are animals that are sentient, but without making use of interpretation at all. And it's interesting that Jesper Hoffmeyer mentioned discussed in one article whether snakes actually made use of interpretation, or whether they were more hardwired really in terms of how they perceive and how they act. And he indicates in that paper that he thinks maybe snakes do like an automated coupling between stimuli and action response without any interpretation in between. And I'm not entirely convinced he's right about that, but at least it raises the question whether we have to distinguish between the neurosemiotic agency of different groups of animals, where of course some are more advanced than others in terms of at least reflexivity and use of interpretative skills.
Sorry, there's a question online by one in those.
Yeah.
This question.
Should I stop sharing maybe?
Thank you. You hear me, Martin?
We can hear you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Martin, for this inspiring talk. I am really looking forward for the book about neurosemiotics. I think you have very good research questions, mainly in relation with the status of mental representations in this. I think they are very good questions. My question now is in relation with, is a kind of a follow-up question with the previous one, because sadly the time run out and you cannot elaborate about agency. And part of the abstract talk, the abstract says that you are going to talk, or what you were going to talk about agency. So I just want to ask you if you can elaborate a little bit more how this is related with agency and the notion of agency that you are working on for this approach.
Yes. So it's true that I didn't get to cover as much as, well, the full paper and as much as indicated in the abstract. But I do think, I mean, if I had more time, I would go on to talk about how what I've said so far is related to the semiotic agency of organisms or also sentient animals of different complexity. And I think an important part of that is to discuss how neurosemiotic capacities is related to organisms' capacity to relate to objects. And there's a connection here with the more complex animals being related to more complex forms of objecthood, or to relate in more complex ways to objecthood. And there's probably some distinctions, some thresholds as well, as I tried to indicate with this snake example. At least that's Hoffmeyer's view, that, I mean, there are some thresholds where we can say that sufficiently complex, cognitively complex animals are able to relate to objects as cohesive, unified wholes, whereas some simpler organisms probably are not. And the question is where to draw the line, really. And that's an important empirical question, really, I think. And then there are several thresholds, so probably not just one, but I think a distinction that it makes sense to draw is between these kind of proper objects and proper subjects that are able to relate to this kind of objecthood. And so they have a high degree of subjectivity and an advanced semiotic agency in this context, whereas some simpler organisms have simpler capacities. So this is also related to the discussion of Tommy Vekavara and Alexei Sharo, for instance, about where to draw the line between genuine semiosis, eusemiosis, and protosemiosis in their terminology. I think we're out of time now. So let's finish here. And I close the session. And now I wonder whether Alin has something to say about what happens next. But thank you all for coming to this session.